Hi folks, and welcome along to this year's Christmas lecture from the Scottish group of the Audio Engineering Society. We're just adding the final touches to our tree.
In the next hour, we'll take a spin around the world of vinyl to discover how the LP record evolved and how the machines that played it revolved.
We'll find out about the mixing, the mastering and the magic involved in creating a record, and we'll explore how vinyl is now outstripping sales of CD for the first time in 20 years.
And we'll hear from experts and fans who love vinyl more than you ever thought possible. So please join us as we drop the tone arm
and get into the groove. Thanks for joining us here in this magnificent lecture theatre at Craig Lockhart campus of Edinburgh Napier University. I'm Sophia Kerr.
And I'm Ailey Tuckett, and we're here in Scotland's capital city with a room full of vinyl fans, a load of fantastic guests, and a big pile of these things to help us explore the history, the development, and the future of the 12-inch long player.
Along the way, we'll be meeting vinyl heads, superfans, obsessive collectors and audiophiles who all have a love for EPs, LPs, 45s and 78s and an unrivaled respect for the machines that play them.
And we'll discover the meticulous engineering involved in these marvellous machines in a short while. But first, how did this flat platter of plastic even become a thing? Our first guest got his first record before the age of 3 and he's never looked back. He's a leading authority on this subject and has an incredible collection of records and turntables.
To share his love of these magnificent music machines, please welcome John Kavanagh.
Thank you. Scientific innovation seldom happens in a vacuum. Thomas Edison rightly takes credit for inventing a machine that could record and reproduce the human voice with his phonograph of 1877, but personally I think his Swiss engineer John Crucy deserves a mention in the process. He managed to take Edison's sketch of the idea, which looks a bit like the engineering version of a doctor's signature on a prescription, and turn it into a workable machine that looked like this. The process involved wrapping a layer of tinfoil around the mandrel, shouting, in Edison's case, "Mary had a little lamb," into the thing, and then playing it back with the same stylus used to record, turning the handle at roughly the same speed too. Not exactly quartz-locked speed control, and not hi-fi. When the tinfoil was removed, the recording was destroyed. Meanwhile, 20 years before Edison, this device was patented in Paris. The phonautograph was the innovation of Édouard Léon Scott du Martinville. The idea here was to create visual representations of sound waves, and these he called phonautograms. There was no suggestion that this instrument's graphic productions could be replayed. The idea with the phonautograph was to coat paper with a surface material soft enough to receive a line traced by a stylus as it moved with the amplitude of sounds, gathered in the case of the photo you can see now, by a plaster horn. The coated paper was wrapped around a revolving mandrel, and in that respect, it's actually pretty close to what Edison was doing 2 decades later. Unlike the tinfoil, and crucially for our story, the flat paper phonautograms could be stored. Scott, who was of Scottish ancestry, died in 1879. His idea of developing the phonautograph for taking down dictation was pretty much forgotten then, and for a long time to come, until the era of the digital audio workstation was in full steam, 2008 to be exact. That year, one of Léon Scott's phonautograms was decoded. The waveform that had lain on file in the Paris Patent Office since 1860 was turned into reproducible sound by a digital imaging program called Irene. When Charlotte Green covered the story on Radio 4's Today programme, she thought the sound so funny that she got a fit of the giggles on air. Personally, I found it hugely poignant to hear a voice that had been hidden away for so long, brought alive by a technology unimaginable in Scott's century. There are 3 documented phonautograms of Au Clair de la Luna extant today. What may have tripped up Charlotte Green was the strange pitch of voice. However, by considering that the voice was actually Scott himself, and by adjusting the pitch downwards, we get this. That's the hot sound of the 20th of April, 1860. A decade later, a young German, still in his teens, migrated to the United States. Whilst doing odd jobs to get by, Emil Berliner studied physics and discovered his gift for invention. An early type of microphone he developed was adapted by the Bell Telephone Company, but it gave rise to a long legal dispute with Edison, which Edison won. However, in a much further reaching way, Berliner became the true victor. Although Edison's phonograph became a ubiquitous name for all record players in America, Emil Berliner's gramophone, patented in 1887, ushered in a flat disc process that would in time render the Edison cylinder record system obsolete, even though the phonograph actually developed to a high level of sophistication. This is one of Berliner's earliest machines. Although it's a crude little hand-cranked device, the records it played are easily identifiable in their similarity to modern vinyl. Sure, there have been many refinements, but it's still a flat disc with a lateral groove. Here's another fantastic piece of archive restoration. Philadelphia-based Don Wilson studied the photoplate held by the American Library of Congress of the earliest documented recording by Emil Berliner. The original disc was lost maybe 130 years ago, but Don Wilson realized a photochemical process by which he could make playable copies of what's known as the Schaldruck record. This is one of them. And here is the voice of Emil Berliner captured in this groove 134 years ago.
4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16.
As both systems developed, and through the early decades of recorded sound, Edison's cylinder phonograph and Berliner's disc gramophone vied for the market. Here's a nickel-in-the-slot phonograph with 9 listeners all together around the machine, and even a spit of listening tubes if you fancy joining in. Meanwhile, with small discs of limited playing time, the Berliner machine was sold as appealing to the novelty market. The person who changed all of that was the man on the right of this photo taken in Leipzig. His name was Fred Geisberg. He didn't call himself a record producer. That title came to be used much later. But he was a recordist and, yes, a producer of thousands of performances captured by the recording horn right around the world. Geisberg's recordings included the first ever Scottish gramophone session in Glasgow in 1898, and yes, it was this piper in a Glasgow hotel room. He recorded the last living castrato singer in Rome as the process was banned by the Vatican. And in the turning point that defined the dawn of the 20th century music industry, Fred recorded the star operatic tenor Enrico Caruso. International star opera singers wouldn't touch the phonograph. Recording wax cylinders before mass production developed involved performing the same thing over and over in front of maybe a dozen or more recording horns and piling up the copies in long, tiring sessions. With the gramophone, the flat disc master could produce multiple copies with ease. Geisberg personally persuaded Enrico Caruso to record for the gramophone company. There was even a bit of proto-hype concerning a story about Caruso's fee. But once the records were made, other opera stars wanted to have their voices committed to posterity, and a frenzy ensued of increasing fees, hugely expensive luxury records, and personal label colours for the megastars of the era. What also happened in these early years of the last century was the emergence of the main standard disc sizes, 7-inch, 10-inch, and 12-inch. This 7-inch record was made in 1901. But if Berliner could come back today, he'd have no problem identifying his format alongside a new 7-inch vinyl single. It's the most enduring format of all. As the gramophone and the deluxe operatic recordings in its catalogue became the chic accessory in Edwardian salons, so the cylinder phonograph drifted gradually out of fashion. Although the acoustic recording process improved across time, it was still very limited in terms of frequency range. Tenors and baritones had a better chance to cut a good recording than mezzos or sopranos. Brass bands often played arrangements of short symphonic pieces because the bottom and top of the string section couldn't be heard on record. When radio began to become popular, record sales plummeted. Not only could the listener hear music without buying the recording, but with microphones and early loudspeakers, the range of sound was enhanced too. With the adoption of the Western electric system in 1925, the record industry began to catch up. The new recordings could capture more subtle dynamics too, so different ways of playing and singing became possible on record, and the effect of the microphone became an instrument in itself. As early as 1881, an experimental telephone hookup devised by Clément Ader placed two receiving sets on either side of the stage at the Paris Opera. The listener to the theatrophone transmission heard a spatial image of the performance. It's largely forgotten that this system and the electrophone version in the UK were available for subscription at home or in hotels and cafes for 30 to 40 years. This was, of course, before the huge innovation that was perhaps too far ahead of its time, stereophonic or binaural recording. Alan Dower Blumlein was the inventor who started that ball rolling. In his all too short life, Blumlein secured 128 patents. He died in 1942 in a Halifax bomber whilst involved in secret radar trials just short of his 39th birthday. His stereo experiments began 92 years ago, yet some of the principles he established in his research work for EMI back then are the same ones in use today. Adapting the binaural system to a visual output using a cathode ray tube, Blumlein developed an early warning system to detect Luftwaffe aircraft at night. Like Alan Turing, Blumlein was an unsung World War II hero for a long time, and that's in addition to his pioneering sound recording work. Around the same time those two-channel experiments were happening in the UK, in America, RCA was working on a longer playing record that ran at 33 1/3 RPM. I say longer, as these were not LPs. Made of an early plastic called Victrolac, they were vulnerable to wear from the heavy pickups of the era, when playing weights were measured in ounces, not grams. RCA abandoned the idea of this as a new format for the public, but the slow speed did have some use for radio and cinema transcription discs. In a bizarre twist of fate, it was Columbia, RCA's arch rival in the States, who brought on a format war between the two companies on the launch in July 1948 of their long-play LP 33 RPM record, which had been developed in top secret to a point where an LP could carry 45 minutes of audio and be played by a 4-gram pickup. RCA Victor's 7-inch 45 RPM discs appeared a few months later, and the competition caused confusion and a huge dip in record sales. Better sense prevailed when the two giants of the American record industry took up each other's format, and business soon flourished as never before. In the UK, Decca was the first label to feature LPs in the early 1950s, and very quickly 3-speed turntables appeared that could play at 33, 45 and 78 RPM. The Garrod 301 turntable set the standard for all to follow. The age of hi-fi had dawned.
Thanks for that, John. It was really interesting, and we'll hear more about your collection later.
And I wonder if today's record buyers would appreciate that history.
What a brilliant question, Sophia. Relevant, insightful, and also in the script.
And so we can segue very professionally into the next part of today's Audio Engineering Society lecture. We took to the streets of Edinburgh to hear from record buyers, young and old, about their own collections, their buying trends, and their opinions on the resurgence of vinyl.
Oh, it's mainly my partner that has a record collection, but I would say around 150.
I don't know, maybe 300 or 400. just under 150 or so.
Maybe around 30?
Maybe two or 3,000?
No, I don't actually. My friends do and my siblings do at home, but I don't own one.
But now that I've opened a record shop, maybe I've got 10,000. They're all mine, but a taxman probably wouldn't agree.
I want to like get a proper collection before I get the turntable.
I've got a turntable and records at home. I get them from the shop just around the corner, Thorn Records.
The reason why I go for vinyl is the excitement. If you go stream, you can just type the name and that's it. But for vinyl, you have to search. I like searching for.
There's just something really cool about holding the album.
If you have streaming, you've got nothing. You've got nothing to look at, nothing to read. It looks better, it sounds better.
I love the sound quality, and I like the fact that an album is quite short. It doesn't go on forever, and you get the pause where you have to turn it over.
You're more engaged when you're listening to it on vinyl.
I think I was attracted by the romance of it and the coolness of it.
If it was on Spotify, it's just kind of you can swipe through how many other artists, how many other songs, but then if you're choosing to put a needle down on a record, you're specifically choosing that set of songs.
We got all of my dad's records from my grandpa's house, and I was like, I can't just let these sit around. So I didn't have to buy any records to start off, which was a great, that was a great introduction.
A few years ago, I was at my house and my dad had brought down all my mum's old records from the loft, and he just kept bringing them down. There were so many of them, and I was looking at all the artwork and I was like, this is sick.
It's going to be 45.9.
Unfortunately, the average price of a record now, I would say, is £30, which is more than I think they should be, but that is just the way it goes.
I think that's the thing I find the hardest with vinyls, is that I will want to get another one, but the price actually stops me buying more records.
They're quite expensive. I usually just have what I have because I really like it.
If I see that they have a new record that I've been thinking about for a while, then I'll go have a look. But I try not to be too often with it.
Well, this is 35. People will complain, but come on, it's nice.
For some reason, vinyl has come back, but I did notice that it had gone away.
I don't think vinyl has ever really went anywhere.
It's definitely a trend.
It's standard nowadays for artists to release their music on vinyl.
It was vinyl, and then it was CDs, and then it was streaming, and now I think we're just starting again.
But I think CDs will eventually disappear, whereas the vinyl will remain and the streaming.
What I've seen, and I'm very happy to report in the last 2 years, is a very healthy growth of people under 30, under 20, buying records of all sorts, particularly Taylor Swift. She's really passionate about vinyl, so as a result, her fans are getting into vinyl.
I have a first edition pressing of Minecraft Volume Alpha. I used to listen to that. I used to listen to that a lot just while studying it.
Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon. I really like that one.
ABBA's Voulez-Vous.
Sales of vinyl have grown every single year since 2007. So when people say, oh, records making a comeback, it's like, well, they've been coming back now for nearly 17 years.
Suede Animal Nitrate 7-inch, the 30th anniversary, but I also have it, the original one from 93 when it came out on 7-inch, and the 12-inch. So why do I need that? I just do.
That's brilliant.
A range of views there, which is exactly what we expected. There's so many opinions and choices, but how do you play the record?
Earlier, we heard about the development of the record as a playback medium, so now we need something to play it on. Have a look at this extensive collection of turntables, from the earliest versions of the music box to the most outrageous pieces of modern audio engineering. Please welcome back John to tell us more. Hi John, do you want to talk us through a little bit of your collection then?
Let's begin with the oldest one on the table. It's the story of an artist and a machine. If you look at the photo on the screens, that shows the English artist Francis Barrard with his dog Nipper, depicted in the most famous trademark in world history. He painted his dog with an Edison phonograph. He could have recorded on a wax cylinder at home, so the dog could have heard his master's voice coming back from that machine. But when he took it to the Edison company, they said, dogs don't listen to phonographs. So he thought, well, I've got this picture, what am I going to do? He went down the road to the gramophone company and said, do you like this? They said, well, if you paint out the Edison machine and put in our snazzy new model with a nice brass horn, we'll buy it from you.
A bit of a newer version than this one.
A newer version than this one. I'm afraid mine is not quite up to the standard of what's in it. It's a bit beaten up, but that's from 1901. It's known as the trademark model for obvious reasons. Let's move along the table to this machine here, which is the first truly portable gramophone. Captain Scott took a big horn thing to the Antarctic, but this went to the trenches in World War I, not this actual machine, but the model. It was made by Decca before they got into the record business, and it became known as the Trench Portable. There was a picture of it, I think maybe in Illustrated War News.
Was it commonly used, or was that?
I don't know how commonly used. I think probably it was just they saw the opportunity from it being pictured in this shot and thought, well, we're going to call it the Trench Portable, and that's what it became known as. How are you going to keep them down in the farm now they've been to Paris? Suggesting a sort of jolliness of the soldiers who went to Paris and France in 1914, the reality very different. Yeah. But that was the model of gramophone with its little horn that went to that part of the whole history. Next to a couple of machines, 1920s into electrical recording, sophistication of reproduction. Here we have a Columbia Graphanola. If you look at the front of it there, inside you can see a folded horn. It's called piano reflex horn. That was rather like the insides of modern loudspeakers. They were using the technology to increase the size of the audio output from a small space. This one here, I'll just step round the side to give it a wind, is an HMV portable made from the 1920s right up to the 50s, and we'll have a very brief blast of Louis Armstrong to give you an idea of what that sounded like. Thank you, Satch. Moving along the table, let's go to a machine from the 1940s. This is made by Pi. It has its little Bakelite tone arm. We're still in the era of single speed, 78 only. Okay. Also has a radio. So this is a miniature radiogram.
And a little dust brush.
And a little brush. You like this, don't you?
I do like the brush.
So you would just have the record spinning, apply that round, and so we're getting into the era of taking care of your records and making sure that the grooves are clean. Yep, nice little item. Further along here, we have Bang & Olufsen turntable in about 1974. Records, when they are cut, are made with a cutter that goes across exactly perpendicular to the groove. Okay. When we replay them with a swinging arc of a tone arm, there's a chance of some distortion in the geometry of that.
So this is very high-tech then?
It's very high-tech at that time, very stylish from the Danish company Bang & Olufsen to make one that had a parallel tracker. Revox made one of those too. And then along to the most modern one that we have on the table here, which uses the belt drive system, very much akin to that loved by the Scottish turntable industry in legendary fashion, the Linn LP12. This is a Michel turntable. So these things used glass and perspex, and they were items of great stylish beauty, as well as very good turntables too. So that's bringing us just a part of the history across the table here.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for that, and I'll have to start saving if I ever want to afford any of these.
Today we're celebrating all things vinyl and asking why in the digital age of downloads and streamings is there such an interest with the vinyl record, and what's driving the amazing growth in vinyl sales.
I feel like, music is just always so much a part of my life and always has been since I was a kid. I can't really say what music does to me, because the me without music isn't there. It's just, music's just such a constant that I only am who I am because of my relationship with music. My introduction to music on vinyl was through my parents. My mum and dad had records when I was growing up. Probably about the equivalent of maybe 2 cubes out of what's on the shelves behind me, and I think maybe about half of it would have been sort of 60s to early 70s kind of pop and rock, things like that. And some of my earliest childhood memories of my parents having music on in the house when I was a kid. Remember listening to Beatles records, and remember loving the Tubular Bells by Mike Oldfield as well, which was another one that my parents definitely had, and I think my mum would play quite a lot when I was a little kid. So yeah, those are my kind of first memories of music on record. And I suppose you know, at the time you're not even really conscious that there's a separation between that the music and the record are in some sense a different thing. I think as a kid you're just like, records are music kind of thing. That's your way of thinking about it. I mean, I definitely still really liked those records at the time, and really, you know, just couldn't really see past, didn't really have my own taste in music at that point, still just really kind of like my mum and dad's taste. And then I think maybe my dad's got a CD player like almost everyone in his generation, and switched to CD around that point with Dire Straits, Brothers in Arms. But I think probably around that point there was maybe a time where I kind of became slightly less keen on new stuff, but realised that my parents had older music in their collection which I was still interested in, like the Beatles albums and a Who compilation, Meaty Beaty Big and Bouncy. There's all this like the Who's kind of best of, which I listened to a lot in maybe my early teens. The first single that I bought was Only You by the Flying Pickets, which was, you know, a sort of a cappella vocal cover of a song by Yazoo that was the sort of group that Vince Clarke had after Depeche Mode. Bought that with my pocket money. The thing that kind of drew me to singles as I was a bit older, it was sort of getting into the more obscure side of 60s music. Part of the reason I was drawn to it in a way was because at that point, like, a new CD cost 10 or 12 quid or something, and kind of realised that in the second-hand shops you could get really great records for £1 each at the time. And I was like, right, why am I wasting £12 on a CD when I can go and find Nevermind the Bollocks for £1? I mean, there's still loads of records that I would love to have, and if I could go back to my 90s self and buy them for the prices that they were on the walls at record fairs in the 90s, I would do it in a heartbeat. But there's things like even like the Zombies Odyssey and Oracle, which is one of my all-time favourite records, and I would love to have a nice like UK original, because again it's one where the sleeve is totally beautiful. That's one of these ones where probably at the time I saw it on dealers' walls at record fairs for maybe about £100 or something, and just thought, crikey, I'm not £100, wow. And I was a student back in the 90s, and about £100. I mean, it would have been literally insane to spend that amount of money on a record then, because that was like a month's rent, and goodness knows what it would be these days. I mean, even though I don't kind of buy as heavily as I used to, it's still my first instinct when I'm in a town. It's hard to see past the US, just because there's so much you know, music is from there, and then also it had sort of local scenes as well. So you go into a record shop in the Midwest, and it might have quite different music to what you find in a record shop in California, especially in terms of kind of like soul and R&B and gospel music especially. In recent visits to the US, I've really got into looking for interesting gospel records, because I feel like it's a bit of an untapped market. I think the first time we went to Brazil as a band, which was in about 2001, and I just sort of started getting into Brazilian music around that time, and was really fortunate to get taken to sort of market stall in Sao Paulo, where there was a couple of record dealers who had things that you would maybe get them on CD in a specialist shop over here, but you'd be extraordinarily lucky to find them on vinyl over here at that point. So I was really lucky with that. And then the other one, I guess, would be Japan, where because Japan has the kind of collector culture and they did like good reissues of American jazz records in the 60s and 70s as well, which to me, again, it's just this like stupid thing of always preferring an old thing to a new thing. But I feel like if there's a jazz record, which I know I'll never afford an original, 50s Blue Note press of, I'd rather have a Japanese one from the 60s or 70s if it's approximately the same price as a kind of contemporary deluxe reissue. Because again, I feel like it's got that connection where the Japanese one is what some I don't know, guy in Tokyo who is a jazz nut in the 60s would have gone out and bought. And so in a way, I kind of like having that connection with the music that's gone round the world and back again. The sort of iconography of the sleeve art was super important, like, Patti Smith horses. It's got the real iconic Robert Mapplethorpe photo on it, and I think got my copy of Nevermind the Bollocks in there, of course, with the amazing like Jamie Reid sleeve. And seeing how the Beatles changed over time through the pictures of them on the sleeve, so you could sort of track them through their hair getting longer, and then the red and the blue album, then the cover on Revolver and Sgt. Pepper becoming psychedelic, and sort of realising that the artists did use the sleeve art to convey something aesthetically as well as through the music. I mean, I don't feel like I have any particular insight into the resurgence in vinyl that isn't something that other people would have said, where it's just people crave the tangible connection with the music that having it on vinyl brings. In some ways, I find the idea of the vinyl resurgence a little bit baffling, because in some ways it's kind of such a flawed medium, in that they're relatively easily damaged. This kind of sound reproduction isn't perfect. They take up a lot of space. They're really heavy to carry if you're going out to, there's all these things wrong with it. But I mean, obviously I do still love it, because I still have like half my living room full of it. But yeah, it's a funny thing. I mean, I suppose in some ways, if you want it to keep sounding good when you play it, you have to be careful with it, and so maybe that's part of what like gives you the connection to it in a way. I guess there's also the financial aspect, where people feel that by purchasing the record, they're supporting the artist in maybe a bigger way than just listening on streaming. I must admit, I don't buy a huge amount of new release albums these days. I guess, I mean, partly, as you can see, just for reasons of space. There's just not, unless I have a big cull and clear some room, I'm kind of just by the dimensions of the shelves, I'm like, well, it's finished.
That was Chris Geddes from the much-loved Scottish band Belle and Sebastian. What an incredible collection, and we'll look forward to hearing more from Chris later on in the show.
We've looked at the chronology of the record's development and the technology, but what about the other ology, the psychology? What does our love of vinyl say about us as individuals, and why has it become so important for younger audiences in particular to own records?
Recent statistics suggest that not everyone who buys vinyl actually has a turntable to play it on. Our next guest will talk us through some of these emerging trends in the record world. We'll hear about music, art and commerce, and how vinyl is once again playing a major role in all of these spheres.
Carolyn King is a musician, popular music lecturer and podcast host. She is also a published PhD researcher whose research will help us understand the resurgence of vinyl. Please welcome Carolyn, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks so much. So initially with my PhD, I wanted to look at why are people buying records when we've got all the music that we want literally at our fingertips for a couple of quid or no quid per month. So on the next slide, you will see the things that have emerged which are very revealing about the current record collector. Ideas about ownership, owning the music that you've actually paid for or not paid for, and a couple of theories that tie in with this I'm going to explain, along with the very famous, the warmer sound, the crackle, the pop, the hiss, ideas around fidelity of sound, and nostalgia, romanticising an era that perhaps you weren't alive during. And lastly, the most significant finding that is now published was around the gendering of the vinyl record space. So, on the next slide, there was a very famous blog post, went viral in 2016, about a person whose entire hard drive was erased remotely by Apple. Thinking Apple thought that there was piracy on the hard drive, but actually it was just files of music that he had created himself in Logic, his own compositions. What this revealed was that the music that's on your laptops, your phones, doesn't belong to you. It's a utility. David Bowie very famously predicted this. We're just going to have music as a rental service rather than an actual possession. So when you buy a record, you obviously take it home, it's yours. As we just saw in Chris Geddes' collection, it's in your home, it belongs to you. It takes up space, but that's not the case with MP3s and streaming. So ownership emerged as a very significant reason that people still buy vinyl and still continue to buy vinyl. Because remember, some communities have always bought vinyl. For example, reggae dub fans, a lot of hip hop fans, and electronic music. So on the next slide, there is a theory, technological determinism, that says that whatever technology does, we follow. However, if that were actually true, we wouldn't be buying records. They would have been done in the 80s with the CD, but we are. So a much more likely theory on the next slide would be something called actor network theory, which gives agency to us as consumers. So what happens is that the technology stays in certain communities. It's then sort of rediffused into society through what is called a boundary object, in our case, the internet. And then it emerges, people jump on a sort of bandwagon, it's reassigned meaning, because, I mean, the record players that you get now don't look like this, and they don't function like this. However, we kind of buy into the idea that they do. And then the object is then put back out into society as we know it now. Vinyl record sales globally have been going up and up and up, and now they've plateaued. However, they're not going anywhere. One of the reasons that emerged was this construction of the sound, the warmer fidelity sound. On John's picture earlier of the famous Nipper's dog, his master's voice, we saw the image of the dog as loyal, and a kind of loyalty, which ties into the idea of fidelity. So the intention behind selling vinyl is that it can recreate the live performance. That's what fidelity is. And this is the Edison tone tests of 1915, when a singer would perform a piece and then it would be played back through the Edison diamond disc at the time. And the blindfolded participants said that they couldn't tell the difference, and that's what was used to market those gramophones at the time. And this has subsequently become further marketing. For example, Tidal as a platform, they market their files that way. That's why it costs more than Spotify or Apple. So that really emerged as a key social construct. And on the next slide, this idea of the hyper-real. We know that the records that you buy in Urban Outfitters are digitally mastered. They're not as like an analog record. They don't have that fullness, but we buy into the idea that maybe they do because they look like they do. So that's called hyper-reality. And the nostalgia for an era that perhaps you weren't even alive in, this romanticization of the record shop, the emergence of rock and roll as something kind of optimistic, was certainly pertinent in my research. And on the final slide, you will see the most significant finding that came out was that there was a significant gendering around the vinyl record space. Typically, these machines weren't marketed to a specific gender. However, around kind of Second World War, with electronics training and the hobbyism that emerged after that, they became very much marketed to men, and women were depicted as almost being against vinyl, hating it, and a sort of domestic war situation, very much in the high fidelity press of the time. And it was my job to sift through all of that and look at the the key findings. However, now the playing field is much more level and more women than ever are running record stores. So, in conclusion, does the medium of music matter? Yes, it does. It matters for all of the reasons I've just said, and it's not going anywhere. So thank you.
Thank you, Carlin, and you'll be back later on to host our guest panel.
Thank you.
Millions of vinyl fans across the world will tell you that it's the sound quality that differentiates vinyl. But do records actually sound better? And if so, why?
Let's hear from a giant from the Scottish record industry, a musician, engineer, producer, and record mastering expert who has been responsible for some of the most amazing sounding albums ever recorded. Callum Malcolm opened the doors to the studio to help us understand how he makes records sound as good as they do.
The reason we have mastering in the first place goes back to the beginning of record production. Most recordings were made on analog tape, multi-track, mostly, we don't go back too far, multi-track tape, which was then mixed down to stereo. The artist would eventually be happy with the album they've made, they've mixed it, they've been very careful with everything, they love the sound of it, they're happy. How do we get it from analog tape, which it would be at that point, into vinyl? Not all records are great records. They are in the eyes of the artist, and quite rightly so. But if they're not well enough recorded, if the recording does have flaws in it, then mastering can help, not always, but it can help improve the situation. Say a record was mixed in a studio that didn't have particularly good monitors, or the engineer was inexperienced. So they've ended up with a recording that actually, if when you take it out of the studio and play it against other things, or an experienced engineer listens to it, he might say, you've got far too much bass here. And A, I don't think that's very good because people won't like that. And B, that will cause the cutting stylus to move vertically and try and come out of the groove. And the whole point is to be into the groove. And this is a major problem. It just would be uncuttable. You wouldn't be able to produce a vinyl record. You can do it with a certain elements, a certain amount of out of phase bass is absolutely fine. But not if it's deep and powerful and there's a lot of it. You just actually would not be able to cut a vinyl. 99% of the time, the client's going to say, okay, what do you suggest? And the mastering engineer, stroke cutting engineer, will say, well, I would take 3 or 4 dB out at the bottom end here because it's too thumpy, too big, and I can get it much louder if I do that. And I could maybe do something about the S's that are a bit strong. I'll try and EQ that a little bit, make that nicer. There are other possibilities if you have a recording, as I've just been handed. In fact, recently, a folk singer called Anne Briggs, this record she did was made, I think, maybe in 1970, 71, pretty old. And she was pretty influential. And they came to me about a month ago and said, we've got this album, Anne Briggs. It was released back in the day. It's a bit of a seminal album. It's well known. Some lovely songs in it. Not particularly well recorded. Okay though. What was interesting was hearing the initial quality of the recording. A number of things were clear. It had too much peakiness in the middle. And I thought, I know perfectly well that even in any electronic system, if you have too much of that energy, it really makes second and third harmonic distortion more obvious. You start hearing it, it's horrible. And also there was lots of traffic noise and nonsense on it, lots of hiss. And I thought, well, we've got tools now that we can use and sort all that out without generating unpleasant artifacts. You can really do it and make it sound transparent. So I did that as well. And I sent it down to Topic and they said, it's a new album. It's just what you can do today that you couldn't do even 20 years ago. Never mind the bones of 50 years ago. What a difference. That's mastering at its most useful, I think, where you can really sort stuff out. So the cutting process involves taking an aluminium disc, which is coated in a lacquer, placing that disc onto a cutting lathe. That resembles a very large turntable. It's a large piece of equipment, has to be very stable. A typical lathe would be at least the size of this console I'm sitting in front of, and has microscopes and other things for having a good look at the grooves on the way so that the engineer can check certain things. Your tape is played into this cutting lathe. The cutting lathe operates in exactly the reverse way that a stylus does on your record player. It vibrates and physically cuts a groove into the lacquer. The lacquer's soft, so it doesn't have to be a terribly powerful thing, but it's still quite intensive. Once that lacquer has been completed, and it has to be done in one spiral, that's important. You can't stop 5 minutes in and say start again. You can't drop the needle in. So it has to be flawless and get to the end of the 20 minutes or 15 minutes of time that you're cutting onto that side. Only the first side, of course, you're doing here. Each side requires a fresh lacquer. You don't flip it over and do the other side. You can play it and listen to it, but you tend not to. You can play and check that everything's okay, but then you cut a new lacquer generally, because even one play of a lacquer will degrade it. And they may only, in any case, last half a dozen plays with a normal, on a record player. You can't, you couldn't keep playing them, they just wear away. So once you're happy, you then would cut a master lacquer that then gets sent off to the metalwork factory. And there, the electrolysis will then reinforce that and make it into a much stronger medium. But it's at that point, the lacquer will be deposited into the grooves, and the shape of the metal part is the opposite of what it's needed. There will be mountains where there were troughs. It's a bit like a photographic negative. You have to eventually produce a positive at the end of the day to get the actual stamper that's going to be used to press vinyl records. Both have enormous benefits, and half speed is a major. It's been going on for a long, long time now, but it's a very simple process. It's more time consuming, exactly twice as long, funnily enough, because it's at half speed. And so it's a bit costlier to do. But the benefits are enormous, and it's a very simple thing. What I do is I upsample the digital master that I'm going to send to the cutting room. So I've recorded at 48 kilohertz sample. I'll upsample it to 96K. That's fine. It's not doubling the speed, it's just putting the sample rate up. But what that does enable the cutting engineer to do, he can then play it back at 48K. And guess what happens? It plays at half speed then. But all the frequencies are there because you've upsampled it in the first place, and you can do that. So everything is intact. It's just playing at half speed. You feed that into the lathe and you run the lathe at 16 2/3, can't remember now, whatever half of 33 1/3 is. So the lathe turns at half the speed as well. That makes the transient response of the stylus much more efficient. It's not having to work so hard. You can cut it louder, a good bit louder, 3 dB louder and cleaner. So where funds permit, I would do that any day. I've just done the albums, they're all triple albums as well. Made a huge difference. They sound fantastic.
So the first process for us as CBAS Vinyl is that we would receive the mastered files from somebody like Callum, and we would receive artwork. So the sleeves designs, the centre label designs, and some cutting instructions about how exactly the artist wants it to sound, what gaps do they want between the records, do they want it to be a loud record, a quiet record, etc., etc. We then work with partners taking that mastered file to do a lacquer cut, and that lacquer then comes back to a company called Stamper Discs, who are based down in the north of England, and they create the galvanic, so the electroplating or the stamper disc that makes the actual record. That's the analog version that we use to fit onto the presses behind me. We would actually then start to make a record. So we will do 3 things in terms of approval. We'll create a test pressing of the record itself. So we'll make 5, 10 copies of that record as a sample on our labels and send it to the artist or to the label for them to review and listen to make sure that the simple, obvious stuff like the tracks are in the right order, that the right records are on the right side, and there's the right gaps between the songs, and then more of a quality aspect of saying, you know, is there something that sounds strange on the record? Do I hear a regular pop or a click? That could be a scratch or a issue on the record. We'd want them to try and come back to us and identify that for us as well. So once we've got approved test pressings from the artist, we would then go into production. So at that point in production, we then start to actually manufacture the records at volume. So we'll, you know, depending on the size of the order, it could be 100, could be 8,000, you know, anywhere, you know, could be, well, it won't never be 500,000, but it'll, you know, we'll start to make those records at the volume required then. Our process is we then make them, leave them to cool for 24 hours. While we're making them, we have a quality processor. We're checking every 10th record visually. We're listening to one record an hour, end to end, to see if there's anything happening with that record as an emerging problem. And then after 24 hours, the records have cooled. We would then actually go to the process of sleeving them. So final QA check done by the team here, and then we put them into sleeves, and ultimately we would put them, then probably within a day or two, we'd put them into the actual jackets, the outer jackets. And at that point then they're ready to ship. So we'd either then be shrink wrapping them here on site, or we will put them in the polyline bags. So essentially the record leaves here as it would appear in the shop, ready for them for a consumer to buy it. I think from a CVAS perspective, our objective that we set for ourselves is really to try and become ideally the most sustainable pressing plant in the world. Like vinyl pressing is unavoidably energy intensive, so you use a lot of energy in making a record, and obviously it's using fossil fuels, so you're using PVC, which is not recyclable, etc. And that's unavoidable at the moment, really. Now, from our perspective, we're still making a piece of art on behalf of the artist, so it's a valuable object. It's not something that should end up in landfill immediately, etc. So we're partly comfortable with that. But what we wanted to do was we've invested significant amounts of money to actually make sure that we're as sustainable as possible. So there's a few different things that we've done more recently. So working with both Plaschem and Ineos, who are our two suppliers, they've developed a low carbon footprint version of the PVC, which reduces the carbon footprint by about 90% versus traditional PVC. But more interestingly again, there's actually a product called Evolution Vinyl, which is plant-based, so no fossil fuels involved in it whatsoever. At the moment, it's not fully audio hi-fi quality. It's probably about 90% of where you would expect it to be, but the focus is, the intention is that it will get to something approaching audio quality in the future. It's still very much in research and development phase, and we will be working with Evolution Vinyl to actually do some testing and become a provider of that product. We're very proud of where we got to, but haven't really had a chance to properly savour that for the last couple of weeks. It's been a bit intense. I think it's been a huge achievement by us and the team that are working with us to actually get to this point at the time that we said we were going to do it, really within the day almost to hit that date, was being a massive achievement by the team. Personally, we are still at the point where we don't feel like we've got it totally under control yet, which is inevitable. So we haven't quite had the opportunity to feel fully excited. There are things that we're getting to do and people that we get to speak to, and listening to music and listening to records is very exciting, but there's times where it's quite hard work at the moment still, and it's a little bit too exciting in some ways.
David Harvey at Seabass Vinyl there, who gave us exclusive access to the very first and so far the only vinyl pressing plant in Scotland. And now it's time to hear another collector's story.
So the first thing that got me involved was actually my father passed me down about 300 of his old records, old classic rock records, and some really, really old like metal records, not really all the kind of thing that I was into whenever I was younger. Had an old beaten up like old Sony record player as well in the house that I used to love putting stuff on. And from there I just started collecting. So it started off going into like alternative music and indie rock. And then as I grew older, started going out, it became like dance music, house music, disco, like looking for really, really well produced stuff, some obscure things from, you know, well before even I was born. And I've just kind of collected through the years, and now I've got, you know, over 1,700 records sitting at home. But nowadays it's mostly, for me, about finding things that get people moving. I love that kind of part of music. You see people instantly feet tapping and heads bobbing, something as simple as that. It's a really good way of connecting with people. The appeal, for me at least, is mostly about that preservation of music history. There's a lot of records that were made in the 1990s and the 2000s, or even the 80s, that were, you know, there was 10 of them pressed. And you discovering something like that and being able to share it with your friends, and it not existing on any other platform. You know, your things like, everyone's got Spotify nowadays, everyone's got YouTube, whatnot, and finding something that doesn't belong on any of those platforms and it's not sitting there, and it's something that you can share with people, and you can, you know, it becomes part of you, it becomes part of like what, you know, what makes your what you enjoy of music, and you can share that with your friends and family. And whether you get to, particularly for me, going out and then playing that for a group of people, and people come up to you asking you, being like, what the hell is that record you just played? Things like that are really satisfying. You can't get that from things like CDs or online streaming, because all of that stuff is available everywhere, and you get to be a part of that preservation of that old music. It can be much more pleasant experience to sit down and enjoy a record than it would be to, you know, stick on a Spotify playlist, or, you know, and again, nothing against that, because there's a time and place. But when you really love music and want to sit down and make a connection with something, or you have things that music represents very specific parts of your life, I think it's important to be able to look through that, and, you know, that has a history. One of the reasons I would say to people to get into it is go and visit record stores. It's one of the best things you can do. Yeah, that's why I say people should get into it, because you can fall in love with music in a completely different way when you have that different type of connection.
Another passionate collector there. Thanks to Max Brown for giving us an insight into his love of records. Vinyl certainly had some serious competition throughout the years. First from the 1/4-inch tape and the 8-track cartridge, and later the compact cassette. But in 1983, it seemed as though vinyl's reign had come to an end with the invention of these things.
The CD became incredibly successful when it was first launched, and not just because of the potential for improved sound quality, but also because of its supposed robustness. CDs were marketed as indestructible in comparison to their vinyl counterparts, which were susceptible to problems like the stylus skipping or jumping, or those annoying scratchy clicks if the record hadn't been properly looked after.
Although they did provide a way to recreate studio audio quality if good mixing and mastering techniques were used, this new format came with a whole new set of rules to follow, intriguingly referred to as the Red Book. Despite this fanfare, this new high-tech format turned out to be trickier to get right than many expected, which resulted in some releases sounding, well, let's just say, flat and lifeless.
And despite marketing claims, it quickly became obvious that CDs were also easily damaged. And despite offering improved sound quality, CD audio and all of its digital relatives, including modern streaming, can also offer poorer quality just because of the need for compression and digital processing. So for some, the humble vinyl equivalent always sounded better. But these are all things we can talk about another time. Maybe next year's Christmas lecture.
We know you need to look after our vinyl, but some folks just went a little crazy, and instead of treating them gently, they did exactly the opposite, the thing you're not supposed to do, deliberately abusing them. And in doing that, a groundbreaking new musical genre was born. Please welcome master turntablist Andy.
There was the Incredible Bongo Band, and it's a track called Apache. This record was one of the, probably the most famous record that DJ Kool Herc used to play in the Bronx in the 1970s at his block parties. Kool Herc is known as the father of hip hop. Whilst he was doing these block parties, he noticed that at the sort of drum section or the instrumental section of the record, the crowd would get really excited. And wanting to capitalize on this, he then started what he then went on to coin as it's called the merry-go-round, where he would take those sections and he would, with two copies of the record, which is what I have here just now, he would extend those, and you could extend those sections, you know, however long you liked. And by doing this, he was able to keep the parties and keep the people that were going to the parties, you know, up and going and very lively. So. As the news spread of the block parties, other people from New York would come to the block parties, and at one point there was a man that came called Graham was it Theodore, and he's the man who's credited with being the father of the scratch. And the scratch is, you know, just the simple pulling back and forth of the record to make a sound. So as this scene developed, as the scratch came along, other techniques would come along, and other DJs would come along and contribute their techniques and their things that they would do with vinyl, to the point where in the 80s, DJing had become almost like a sport, in that there were competitions and various DJs all over the world would compete, showing off their talent, showing off their different ways where they could manipulate records sort of rhythmically and also, in a sense, improvisationally to impress people and win these competitions. So in that way, scratching and scratch DJing would become very technical, and as a result, it would eventually become known as turntablism. And in turntablism, the record player is kind of seen as an instrument, and the DJ would be manipulating the instrument in order to express themselves and do improvisational things, and so on and so forth. So if I just give me a wee second, I'll just change the records here, and what I will show you is kind of what they were doing. Like I said before, they're basically just taking the records and moving them back and forth in a way where, by using pitch, they were able to sort of change what you would hear.
We're now going to progress to some steps which are a bit more difficult. Ready, set, and begin. Hit it, maestro!
So we have a sound like this. Now we also have a mixer in the middle which controls both of these, but the mixer also has a way for you to control the volume, so you can cut things off. So we have simple things just like we control the pitch, but then we can add the fader into that, and then we can have like that. And then if we have a piece of music to make this kind of make a little bit more sense, and then what we can also do is we can also use like a tone to really show how we can affect the pitch. And this is kind of almost like where things become a bit like jazz, become a little bit more improvised.
Thanks, Andy. That was amazing.
No
So,
worries.
how did you get into that?
I think growing up in the 80s, breakdancing was very, very popular at the time, and hip-hop culture was like really, you know, coming coming up. So I think there was a lot of documentaries. So I think I watched one of the documentaries called Style Wars, and it had Grandmaster Flash on there doing what I was just doing with 2 copies of a record. And for whatever reason, I thought, that's for me.
So how long have you been doing this for?
So I've been a hip-hop DJ for like over 30 years. I started the first hip-hop club in Edinburgh, and I've been DJing and producing music in Edinburgh for, at least the last 20 years. So, yeah, a wee while.
Perfect. That's amazing. Andy, everybody.
Thank you.
We've nearly reached the run-out groove of this particular long player, but before we go, let's hear more from our guests. And to introduce them, please welcome back Carlin King.
So please welcome back writer and broadcaster John Kavanagh, musician Chris Geddes, and musician and academic Dave Hook. Thank you. So the first question I would like to ask would be, of all these wonderful machines you've brought, John, which is your favourite and why?
Difficult question. Probably the model that corresponds to the HMV trademark. It's the oldest. It defined something that became a global phenomenon, which was the music and record and machine industry. And by the time I came to collect, most of those things were long gone, so I was really lucky to find one. So I'm fond of that machine.
Fantastic, yes. And Chris, how many records have you actually got?
I think altogether maybe around 4,000. I think there's probably on the shelves that you saw in the video. That's maybe about sort of 1,500 LPs, and then I've got maybe about the same amount again away in a lockup, which is more kind of like dance music, hip hop type stuff, which I don't really play in the house anymore. And then maybe about 1,000 or 1,500 7-inches. So it's more than anyone needs, definitely.
Amazing. And can I ask how they're organised? Because that is quite a crucial part of being a collector.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite an idiosyncratic way, I would say. I mean, it's kind of my own mental map of music, and it's a mixture of by style of music. So like all the soul stuff is together, all the jazz stuff is together. But then I think stuff from countries, I think this is quite bad maybe, but stuff from countries like with the UK and the US, I maybe tend to lump together in my mind as foreign. And so there's sections of like just foreign music.
Yeah, fantastic. And Dave, how did you get into vinyl in the first place?
I would say I probably have a sort of dualistic relationship with vinyl. As a listener, a music fan, a consumer, I love the journey that it takes you on. I love the physicality of it, and you know, the combination of the artwork and the lyrics and all the things folks have talked very eloquently about earlier on today. As a musician, I see it much in the way that Andy has explained it, as turntables and vinyl being an instrument and another tool for making music. You know, and in that context, I probably take an approach almost that's the antithesis of the audiophile in terms of high fidelity, that I love the crackle and the dust and the noise and all the artifacts that end up in there, that when you sample them become some of the textures that you can then use for other stuff.
Yeah, what do you think about artists who try and now add that in artificially?
I think that's a great way to do it. I mean, it's interesting. We're in a position just now where we can spend an awful lot of time and money trying to recreate things that technology did anyway 30, 40 years ago, you know. There's some tools for doing it really well. It's also great fun to do it using the sort of original technologies. And, you know, it's not a new thing. Like Portishead in 1993, 94, when they put Dummy out, were recording live breaks, pressing them to test pressings and kicking them about the floor to scuff them up, and then sort of, you know, creating that authenticity to their new recordings.
Largely on CD, because CD was the main seller at that time.
Wasn't it?
Yeah, they're massively anti-streaming. I was at a Portishead sound check once, and my hearing's been damaged ever since. So. Yeah, I mean, on that note, what do you think of streaming in terms of the reward for the artist and the listener? Because, I mean, effectively it's 10% of the original file, right, due to compression?
Yeah, well, streaming, I think that the music industry slept when Napster came in. They should have done the deal back then instead of letting the horse bolt as mentioned before, David Bowie saw what the future was going to be, and by the time they said, oh, hang on a minute, we're not making money anymore, this thing hasn't gone away, they were stuck with it, and people expected that to be what happens. And the situation we've reached now is that, thankfully, vinyl and small pressings and so on for artists is giving them a revenue stream to sell at gigs, which actually helps to earn a living because people want to buy those things at shows, and it gives them a direct input of making some money from their music, which from something like Spotify, which has tried to cut off the bottom 0.5%, which is probably the most of music that we all listen to. Yeah. The bottom 5%. Oh, we're just not going to pay them. Imagine if the MU and the MCPS rather did that. It'd be an outcry.
Yeah. Yeah, what are your thoughts on this as an artist, Chris?
I mean, I think my thoughts on it, maybe as an artist, are different to my thoughts as a consumer, and I'm in both camps, because I mean, I think as a consumer it is an amazing thing, and to have access to like the whole history of global music at your fingertips is an amazing thing. I mean, but as an artist, the rates it pays aren't great, especially for a band of multiple people like we are. I mean, I think if you're a self-contained solo artist and you completely own all your own masters and all your own publishing and stuff, then if you get to a certain threshold, then I think you can have quite a good income from streaming if you're hitting maybe millions of streams on Spotify, which sounds like a lot, but a lot of people do get to that. But, you know, for where we are, where we're a 7-piece band and we're signed to a label, so we only get a royalty of the royalty that goes to Spotify. It's not great for us in those terms.
Yeah, any thoughts on this, Dave?
I mean, I agree entirely. I mean, it's complicated because there is a democratization of access to music for folks, and you know, some of the things that Chris was talking about earlier about having to dig for and be in the right country to even get your hands on, you now can get access to. But the flip side is that the financial model doesn't work for people making music. You know, and that's where vinyl and the resurgence in vinyl comes back in, because you know, if you can, it is potentially possible for independent artists to find the capital to make small pressings, which they can then transform at live gigs into real revenue. You know, and people love the physical artefact that comes with it.
Absolutely, yeah. And now we've got a pressing plant in Scotland. Thank you, Dave and Dominic at Seabass Vinyl. So their focus is really on creating sustainable vinyl. Do you think vinyl can be sustainable, John?
I think this idea of plant-based vinyl sounds fantastic. I'm looking forward to hearing it. You know, there were many attempts at making different formats of record, different compounds. The first unbreakable discs were made as far back as 1901. So there have always been developments, and if this is a new one and he can get that extra 10% that he's talking about, it's sort of 90% there, that's tremendously exciting. Yeah.
Fantastic. I did read that a lot of the early shellac discs were made out of kind of beetle resin, so not for the vegans.
Gosh, there were all sorts of things that went into them. At one point they used vulcanite rubber, and at one point, to make it a bit more viscous and a bit more stable for wear, they put in powdered cow hair. You can imagine what that did to the surface noise. There are all sorts of things went into records.
Wow. So hopefully we're moving towards a more sustainable product now. So thank you very much for that. Thank you.
And Carolyn, thank you so much for all your contributions today, and best of luck with your PhD.
That's all we have, so it's time we made tracks. So thanks to the guys here and to everybody else who took part in the show. To all the Edinburgh Napier staff and students who have done such a great job in delivering today's production, and to the Audio Engineering Society of Scotland for arranging it.
And speaking of which, if you're super excited about sound, you could always join the AES. Details of how to join will be at the end of the programme.
And our final thanks to you guys here at Craiglockhart campus in Edinburgh, and to you, wherever you are in the world. It's been a pleasure getting into the groove with you. From all of us here, it's goodbye and Merry Christmas.
you've been inspired by today's show, why not join the Audio Engineering Society? We have local events in Scotland and all around the UK, in fact all around the world, where you can connect with thousands of professional audio engineers, research scientists and sound students working in diverse areas such as film and television, theatre, the games industry, recording studios, medicine, forensics, music technology, communications, computer design and live music. You'll also get free access to our extensive online knowledge base and a few more things besides. Log on to the website www.aes2.org to find out more. We look forward to hearing from you soon.